Building an Inclusive Workplace Environment. My name is Schlesinger. I'm an instructor at Galvanize for the Web Development Immersive Program. Prior to working for Galvanize, I worked for Teach for America, and I taught elementary school special education music for 6 years. And workplace diversity and inclusion is something that's really important to me. So I assembled this panel of phenomenal humans to talk with me about it, and there will be lots of opportunities for you to ask questions about halfway through the panel. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. First, we have Louisa Barrett, who is the Director of Front-End Engineering at the Turing School of Software and Design. She's the former Director of the Colorado Chapter of Women Who Code, past chapter leader for Girl Development, Denver Boulder, and she's been working with the team at Ruby Central for the past 3 years. She began her decades-long career in tech as an illustrator and graphic designer, and a passion for understanding how people interact with their products and environment led her to programming. She has a soft spot for UX, typography, and correcting students when they refer to an assignment operator as an equal sign. Let's give a round of applause to Louisa. She's the Director of Professional Learning at Turing School of Software and Design. Ellen Mary is a coach, facilitator, and designer. She has more than 13 years of experience working in K-12 education as a teacher and instructional coach, and she moved to support nonprofits who are raising the standards of what's possible in the education industry. For over 6 years, Ellen Mary worked for Teach for America as the Vice President of the teacher leadership team responsible for over 200 educators. As the Director of Professional Learning at Turing, she ensures that students are getting the best experience in the classroom and that instructors are continually being supported and developed. A round of applause for Ellen Mary. Sitting next to Ellen Mary is Teddy Mall. She's a lead web development instructor at Galvanize Boulder. Teddy had an interesting path to where she is today. She studied computer science in college and then left and decided to become a photographer. She ran her own wedding and portrait photography business for 13 years before she decided to attend Galvanize as a student and rejoin the tech industry. Now she is teaching others that the tech industry is not just for tech nerds. Teddy. Next is Nina Baliga. She's a UX designer, co-founder of Diversity, and a prospective CEO from 10-10-10. Nina has worked in the nonprofit and for-profit sectors for nearly 20 years, bridging the gaps between the needs of sustainable businesses with the public good. With 10 years of work in the tech sector under her belt, Nina has focused on user experience design, digital strategy, and digital development. She's currently starting 2 businesses, Diversity, which I'm a co-founder, and she's working on a business connecting that's our business. She's focused on connecting companies to diverse talent in the tech sector. She's also creating a health tech startup focused on improving patient outcomes through health literacy. A round of applause for Nina. And Peter Ostegai Scheid is our final panelist. He's an associate web development instructor at Galvanize Denver. Prior to working at Galvanize and being a student there, Peter worked in medical research for years, first at the University of Chicago, then at the University of Colorado. He attended the immersive at Galvanize and has been teaching there ever since. Let's give a round of applause for Peter. All right, so first question for the panel is, what does diversity mean to you?
No one is volunteering to talk, I will start. To me, what diversity means to me is that I think the biggest picture, sort of 10,000-foot view, is just diversity means different perspectives. So I think it's really important to be mindful when you're in tech, and the whole point of tech and building products like this is that we're building things to solve problems. And the more perspectives you have to understand what those problems are, to identify those problems, the more likely you are to actually solve the correct problem, and then be addressing it in a way that is going to actually, so you're solving the right problem and you are doing it in a way that is setting yourself apart from the crowd, because ultimately there's a lot of people trying to solve similar issues, and having a diverse team means you're bringing in all of these different perspectives, all these different ideas that you may not feel if you have a really similar team. And an example of this that I think is really interesting, at Turing, one of the things that we do, we have a lot of sort of diversity initiatives, and one of the things that we do is Ellen Mary, every module, does a screening of debugging the gender gap, and there is one piece in there, and she may be able to explain the story a little better, but it's talking about when airbags in cars were first invented, and the team that was creating the airbag were all like about 6 foot tall guys. So they built an airbag that was going to protect them, right? So they built an airbag that was going to be super successful at keeping someone who was 6 feet tall, weighed like, I don't know, 160, 180, however much a 6 foot tall man weighs.
185.
185. The gentleman in the front. So they solved this problem for themselves, and then it actually led to fatalities because they hadn't solved it. They didn't have perspective. They didn't have any outside opinions about what they actually were solving for. And so to me, diversity is avoiding like an airbag situation with your product, with your team, with your company.
I totally agree with that. I think that in addition to perspectives, I think about diversity as like who's in the room. And if we have a situation where who's in the room like looks all the same or thinks all the same way, or we don't even know the backgrounds of who's in the room, then we probably haven't done enough to create a diverse experience, a diverse perspective, a diverse team. And that means that we need to really be thoughtful about that. And that first layer of diversity comes with a lot of reflection. Being able to have the conversation, being able to take the time to say, like, what are our backgrounds, what are our perspectives that we're bringing to the table is just so important. I think so often, I say this to students, like, our students just want to, like, jump in and code. That's all they want to do. I want to be a software developer. I want to be a software developer. I want to be on my computer all the time. And the thing that we talk about is actually stopping and being able to talk about, like, where did you come from and what's your experience and what's your background, and when we approach this problem or we get this deadline for 3 days from now, how are we going to best like leverage our strengths to be able to get to that. And I think that with like diversity means taking time to actually understand the people around you. And not just assuming that because you look a certain way or sort of like your appearance is a certain way that means that X, Y, Z is going to happen or you're going to bring these things to the table. So I think that's something that's just like extremely important when we're thinking about diversity is actually spending the time to not assume what someone's diversity is, but actually being able to discuss that is just like really critical and a foundational piece of having true diversity in your space.
That was a really awesome answer. You guys are I should have gone first. I should have taken the microphone. To me, diversity is thought and not assuming that you know what diversity is when you look at people. When you look into a room, you might assume that, oh, this must be diverse because everyone looks different. But it doesn't mean that. You really have to listen. Like, listen to people's experiences, listen to what they're bringing to the table to figure out, do you actually have a diverse group here that is here to solve a problem that you're trying to solve? Because if they all look different, but they're all thinking the same thing, then you may not be solving the problem that you think you're solving. And I know we have a few more questions coming, so I'll save the rest of what I want to say for the other questions.
So I'm not going to straight up disagree with folks, but I'm going to add another layer. I think that diversity is gender, it's race, it's ethnicity, it's age, it's like Kim and I, when we were in the process of starting to think through, the business we're building, which is around connecting tech companies to diverse talent, we sat down and we said, how do we define diversity? And we started thinking about all those measures and metrics, because one, there is a data perspective when you are defining diversity. And I think that's important to consider. I think everything that the other panelists said is an important thing to think about when you are at one level of defining diversity. But the fact of the matter is we live in a society that's very visual and people make assumptions about you immediately. And unfortunately that also means that a lot of negative assumptions are going to be made for you if you're not a white male. So starting from that place to think about diversity by looking about how people look at you, I think is an important part to consider when you are looking at diversity, because we don't have the time to dive into deep conversations with everybody to find out the diversity of thought and the diversity of opinions. So it's a place to start, is by looking at the surface, unfortunately, and then you can dive from there.
Yeah, and I got to go last, so I don't have a ton to add to those excellent answers. I guess I would say, in my experience, a lot of the same stuff in terms of blind spots and things like that, especially in the classroom, look less like we talked about, people have different learning styles and things like that, but I mean, we can only have so many teaching styles, but I think being aware of, the way people approach questions or approach authority, and the way that they're comfortable getting what they need out of the classroom and telling you that, I think that's sort of, the more faces that they have, the more experiences and perspectives that they have to approach, the more likely they are to get that out of what they need.
Thank you, everyone. So we are doing a panel at a developer conference, and this industry is notorious for its lack of diversity. I think one thing that's interesting about all of us is that we entered the tech industry without a degree in computer science. So I think almost all of us are boot camp grads. Maybe not Ellen Mary, but she now works at a boot camp. But Nina went to GA and got her certificate in
Yeah, I did the UX immersive.
the UX immersive, and we have Galvanize web development immersive grads, and you were the Turing's first, Galvanize's first class.
That's in the second G school.
Okay, second G school cohort. So that's an interesting thing I think about this panel, and a way that I think these companies are trying to work with bringing in more diverse people into the tech industry. So one thing I noticed when everybody gave their definition of diversity was I think I heard two different things. So Nina, you were saying actually diversity is things about you. Maybe it's your ethnicity or your race or your gender, or it's where you came from, if you're from a rural place or an urban place. I also heard diversity means knowing about the people around you and knowing about their backgrounds. And that's going to segue into the next question, which is, what is inclusion? What does inclusion mean to you? So I'll just leave it at that. What does inclusion mean to you?
I was thinking about this one on the way here today, because I knew about this question. And I was thinking, what does inclusion mean to me? I had a job in the tech industry, not Galvanize. And we're all developers, right? There was a group of 4 developers. And we weren't very diverse if you looked at us, because it was 3 white guys and me. And I felt very different because I'm a black woman. I was in my late 30s at the time, and they were all in their 20s, no one over 30. And I was in my late 30s. And also, I had kids, they didn't have kids. I was married, they weren't married. So there were a lot of different things that were different about me. And I didn't necessarily feel included. I didn't feel like it was an inclusive environment. It wasn't hard to work there. I enjoyed my job. So it wasn't like it was, what's the word that people use when they're talking about an environment that's like a caustic, a hostile environment? It wasn't a hostile environment. It just wasn't an inclusive one. So I always felt like, okay, I need to figure out how to show them how I'm like them, as opposed to them doing things to make me feel like I'm included at the table. So to me, inclusivity is making other people feel like what they have to say matters, and that you're valuing it, that you want it, that you want them to show you what's different about you, and how is that going to enrich our lives here.
Yeah, I think, so if diversity is who's in the room, I guess inclusivity to me is more who's part of the conversation. And I think that's a lot more important. Diversity is important because you can't have an inclusive conversation without it. But I mean, there could have been 100 women on the team designing the airbag, but if the only people listening to the jobs were the 10 men that were 6 feet tall, then you would still run into the exact same problem. So you might have happy lawyers if if your employees look like a perfect cross-section of America, but if you're not actually listening to anybody who's there, then what's the point? You're not actually getting the benefits out of that and closing those blind spots that you would have otherwise.
I want to share a story about going to one of the startup weeks in Colorado. And there was a kind of a presentation by these a diversity consultant and a UXer, and they were trying this experiment where they wanted to work with the local startups to help them figure out how to increase diversity in their companies. And so they were sharing the results of the whole like design sprint process they did over the course of one weekend. And at the end of it, all of their results, I mean, everyone in the room was white. So they were all like nodding their head like, wow, what great ideas you came up with. And I was looking at it and I was like, you clearly didn't have any people of color in the room when you were doing this design sprint. Because and it was clearly all Boulder people in the room because their idea of inclusivity was giving everyone bicycle hats. And it's like, oh, well, if we give everyone the same swag, then everyone will feel included. And and no one called them out on it at that presentation. And one person kind of like leaned over to the director of one of the companies that was leading this effort and said, hey, did you notice that there were like no black people in the room? And he's like, yeah, we just couldn't find any. And so like, I think this is like one of the issues with inclusivity. I don't think I'm directly answering your question, but I'm just gonna talk anyway. I mean, I think when it comes to inclusivity, like we have to think about whenever you're creating any processes, that you're ensuring that there's a diverse set of experiences and backgrounds. Because like, if there was, I guarantee if there was a woman of color in the room who spends $200 on her hair extensions, she would not be into wearing a bicycle hat. And,
or maybe if she just had curly hair.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's just, I think when we're talking about inclusion, we have to be cognizant about the opinions that go into how do we create inclusion, but then we also really have to think about having those conversations with diverse people to figure out how do we create an inclusive environment. And I think that's particularly important when we're talking about company cultures. I think a lot about inclusion being, like creating inclusion means that someone doesn't have to give something up to come into the space. That they don't have to give up part of their culture or their identity or like how they represent themselves when they walk into your space to feel like they can be there, like they are welcomed, like they belong. I think about inclusion as like this sense of belonging. And when, especially, you know, not only in our staff, but like when our students come on day one, like what message do we send about who belongs here in tech, who belongs here at Turing? And if we're not like explicitly clear that everyone who is in this space belongs, then implicitly we're saying like there's probably a certain type of people who belong here and there's certain type of people who don't. And so I think about inclusivity not only being like this, like how do you create that space, but how do you maintain that space, and how does that space then like evolve over time with the different types of people that you bring in, because you have to start somewhere. So you have to start, if you have an all-white team, like you have to start with small changes, but you have to be able to create that space and think about who has power and privilege and who's giving power and privilege to allow people to feel heard or feel valued or feel like they actually inherently belong in this space. And if you have power and privilege in that space, you have to actively give that. You have to actively be able to say, you know, here's like who we want here. Here's who belongs here. You belong here. And here's why you belong here, because this is like our mission. This is what we care about. Like this is what we think you bring to this. So I think there's a lot of like diversity matters in terms of if you do not have a lot of diversity of thought, opinion, background, race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, you're not going to have a lot of opportunity for people who are different to be able to come in and feel welcome in that space.
So as has happened already, everyone has said wonderful things, and I feel like I'm just going to say the same thing over again. But I agree that like for me inclusion, and again I'm considering sort of like in the workspace in a working environment, inclusion to me is a sense of safety and that you can be who you truly are. You don't have to, like Eleanor said, you don't have to like hide anything. You can really like be the way that you are. You can express the feelings that you have and the thoughts that you have, the opinions that you have in a way that people are going to listen to you. You will be heard. No one is going to like talk down to you. No one is going to like act like what you said doesn't matter. It doesn't have weight behind it. And again, sort of, I also have a story about being at a tech event, because that's just fun storytelling. And sort of understanding that I feel like as far as like diversity issues go, I am like a white lady, and so I probably don't face as many challenges as people of color. So I was at a major like national tech event. I was volunteering, and I'd also been speaking. I was a speaker at this conference, and I was there with my boss, and I was talking to someone, just like during the hallway tracks when you got your schmoozing in the hallway, and this gentleman, who happened to be a white man, first was like, "Oh, so are you having fun here?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm having a great time at the conference. It's great." And then he was like, "So are you here with your husband? So you're here with your husband, right?" And I was like, "No." I was like, "I'm a speaker." And he's like, "Oh." But it's just like the idea that, you know, like me being there wasn't like, if I had been a man, there wouldn't have been a question that I was there because I was excited about the industry, that I was interested in the content, that I was there because I actually like had opinions about this stuff. It was like just his automatic assumption that the only reason that I could be there was because a man had like brought me along as a guest, and that I wasn't interested in it, and he was like basically just talking to me to be like, "Oh, let's just talk to this lady who must be bored." Like, what? It's just like, it was kind of just very confusing, and it's and then because of like I've done a lot of work with people really well, and I've really tried to be involved in organizations that help promote people who may not feel like they have a strong voice in this industry, and stories like that really like make me, they push me to like come in every day and to like care about stuff like this because it's stupid. So feeling like you have place for you to feel like you belong and that you have a voice is really important to me.
Thank you. So the last question was about what does inclusivity mean to you? Oh, God, we really hit on some interesting things there. So a pattern that I noticed, diversity and inclusion. So one question to ask yourself and your team and about your company is just who is here in the room? Like who works at this place or who goes to school here? And like it actually matters, the types of people who are there. And so often like that can be done. Like I think we as a tech industry and the boot camp industry have some strategies for bringing people in the door. But more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but after that, there's like this tremendous follow-up. How do people exist in the space that you've created? Are they part of conversations? Are they part of design thinking? Do they get to make decisions? And how does it feel for them to be in that space? Do they get to be themselves? So keeping those things in mind, who is here, who's part of our organization, and how do people get to exist in our organization? Let's move on to our next question, which is geared toward teams who want to make a change this afternoon or whenever you go back to work. So let me look at my list so I can say it really precisely. What are some actions and behaviors teams can start using immediately to create a more inclusive environment?
Winging it.
Go for it. I have a lot of opinions on this.
So I would say like number one, any action is good action. Like just stop saying you want to do something and like just start doing it. But I think one of the things, like especially if you're sort of like starting from zero, let's say, I think first and foremost is to have a really clear conversation with leadership, your leadership team, like whoever your leadership team is, to ensure that like there is strong buy-in, that it is important, because I've seen over and over again teams or companies or organizations who are like, we love diversity, like we want to be more diverse, and we're going to do all these cool things to like recruit more diverse people, and then they're going to like walk out the door the second they come because this is a really terrible place to be. Like that comes from if leadership is not bought in. Like this, you can sort of like mandate anything for a small amount of time, but like that's not the purpose. Like that's not the point. Like the point is to create a better place for everyone. Like for everyone. Like everyone who's on your team currently and everyone who's new there. So really thinking about like leadership, like how much is leadership bought in? Like what is the conversation that leadership's having? If you're a part of the leadership team, like how are you investing others? How are you like meeting them where they are and then being able to say like, if this is important, we're going to take some steps towards it. The second thing is, I think is really helpful is to do a potential like culture audit. Culture AMP does this awesome inclusion survey that is, I think there's 6 different categories that they look at. They look at sort of like overall experience for your people. They look at power, like who makes decisions, how is communication, like what does communication look like through the organization, and it's all of these different sort of like ways to look at culture. And doing that survey, that's actually one of the first things we did at Turing to take on some like it allows for both short-term and long-term change. It's an anonymous survey. Culture AMP gives it to you for free because it's like part of their research and development of how to create more inclusive tech companies. And it's just like so eye-opening because these questions are all about like how are people experiencing your organization. If your organization's not that diverse, like you're probably going to have some like pretty similar experiences. But like starting to at least engage there and say like what are people past and present experiencing here is really important. I think there has to be like a lot of internal work that you do. I think you have to be able to reflect for yourself on like where is my power and privilege, what is my experience, what are my, as you said, like blind spots, what are my lenses that I think are really important, and then what are the lenses that I have like no understanding of, and how do I start to build my own understanding. Don't make other people educate you. Don't make other people like tell you all about their stories so that you can understand it better, empathize it better. Like do some of your own work and like do that work deeply and do it every day and reflect on like many things out there. You can take the Harvard implicit bias test. You can do some anti-bias training. I'll come find me and I'll do a microaggressions training for your team. Like there's so many things that you can do, but if you are not actually doing the reflection for yourself, like every time someone's like, what can I do, what can I do? I'm like, I need you to think about this and like do some reading and do some deep reflection on like how did you grow up and what biases you have and what are your stereotypes, because everyone has them. And if you can't start talking about them, don't expect other people to talk about them. So do the work first for yourself, and like then, you know, as that starts, like do that with your direct team in check-ins. Like what does that conversation look like? If you can give your team some common language around like privilege and bias and microaggressions and power and like all of that, it's so much easier to interrupt the cycle. It's so much easier to say like, whoa, Louisa, like we're really working on like how we're being really like stereotyping some gender roles right now, and like let's talk about that. Or like none of our female students are talking in class ever. Like what do we want to do about that? If you can start to have some of that common language, it's so much easier to engage in that day-to-day conversation. Don't just make it like Diversity Friday. Like that's like the worst thing that you can do, because that's just not going to lead to anything. I have a lot of other things that
So as part of our research right now, Kim and I are reaching out to companies in Colorado. We got a meeting with the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Ball. And Ball is one of the places that was awarded, so HRC has an LGBTQ kind of like diversity scoring system. And they give out awards for companies that score very high on their inclusiveness. And so Ball was one of the ones that scored 100%. And there's 5 other companies in Colorado that also scored 100%. They have a kind of continuing meeting. The 5 companies meet together all the time to figure out how they can continue to build diversity and inclusion initiatives within their companies. These are pretty large companies. I think the key thing that I heard from meeting with the VP of Diversity and Inclusion at Ball was that if you don't have the leadership bought in, like 100% bought in, like championing it and saying this is a #1 priority of our company, this is going to impact our bottom line, we are not going to be profitable if we don't make this a priority, then you're kind of screwed. And so I think when it comes to any businesses you're starting, you have to draw the connection right away that diversity is completely connected to money. And if you're a for-profit business, like that's the way you're gonna get heard. And study after study has shown that companies that are more diverse make more money. So I think that's kind of like the big selling point on what you do is to start having those conversations with leadership and start getting them involved and making a business case for why they need to be doing it.
I guess I would say, just real quickly, and I guess not to necessarily disagree with you, but because there is, like, I'm not going to tell you about 29 years as a gay guy, but like asking, like, hey, you know, are we doing okay on that front or something like that? Just opening that conversation makes it a lot easier and making it known that even if you're not asking at that moment, that I can say, hey, I think we might be screwing up on this front or something like that. It's just opening that line of communication, I think, is a really important, really easy thing to do. Like Kim said, you can do that at lunch today. So.
Sort of feedback off that, I don't have the extensive research that you do. But this like open lines of communication, I think, as well as just being really honest and really consistent. So not being afraid to have difficult conversations. So like if you see somebody behaving in a way that is like shutting someone down or closing, like making conversations not happen or shutting down, like just treating someone in a way that is not right, being willing to address that right away and not being afraid of having hard conversations. And I think, you know, since we're in education, then we're sort of like training people who are going to be going out into the industry like this we are, and we're kind of like under a microscope a little bit, and the things that we do have a far-reaching impact because the way that we for a lot of these students, this is their first introduction to what tech is. And if we are allowing like racist, sexist, homophobic, any of these sorts of like attitudes or behaviors or like comments or conversations, if we're allowing them to like continue, then we are not doing our part to like improve or to like make this industry better. And I think that's where just like being honest with people. So like Eleanor said, like we've set very clear kind of like boundaries right off the bat, like this is okay, this is not okay. We have like, if you do this, we're gonna get in your business about it. And then just not letting anything slide. And again, just like making sure that people feel safe. So if we're not present and something happens, like if it's someone on staff, if it's a student, if it's just someone in our community, they know that they can come to us and that we will take action. We will not just like brush under the rug. We will not tell them that their feelings are not valid. We will not act in a way that isn't going to support them. And I think that that's just like small steps, like making people feel safe, making people feel heard, and knowing that you will address things consistently and honestly, regardless of the situation. I think is really important.
So I'm not an expert, yes. But I am a lead instructor in the classroom. And I'm educating people about this industry, and how to act in this industry, and how to act with one another. And being in a position of power in the classroom means that I can't just sit back and see something that I don't like and leave it. The other students could, right? They could, they may not. But as the instructor, I need to say something. I need to be compelled to say something. So if you are in a position of power in your organization and you see something that's not right, you need to speak up. Because if you don't speak up, then why are the people around you going to also speak up? That leads to the buy-in that they were talking about from the top, right? I'm not the top at Galvanize, but I am the top in the classroom, right? And so I'm setting the tone for what's appropriate in this classroom and what we're going to say, what we're going to do, and how we're going to treat one another. And I think that's it, right? Like if you're in a position of power, do something. Don't just sit back.
So thank you for those strategies, approaches, sort of the summary of what I heard. Organization-wide is that you have to ensure that the leadership of your company or your school is bought into having these conversations, because without it, it's an uphill battle or may not happen at all. To do a culture audit, to actually see how people are experiencing their work or school life in your organization. Creating a common language among staff and students about power and privilege and microaggressions, and making sure that those are conversations that can be had. Sort of some more, some things that individuals or teams can implement. Ellen Marion really said like self-reflection, like individuals have to take responsibility and do self-reflection and read and take that on their own. Something I heard was, I like what Peter said, just ask people how they're doing. So for me, one of the most powerful questions I've ever been asked is, what is it like for you to work here? Or I live in a co-op in Boulder. Somebody asked me once, what is it like for you to live here? And that I was like, wow, how has no one ever asked me this at my home or work before? So actually just asking that question, I think, is incredibly powerful. Or asking people, more specifically, what is it like for you as a woman or a gay man or a person of color to be in this organization? Having difficult conversations was something that Louisa and Teddy alluded to. And Teddy, if you have power in your organization, you actually have the burden of speaking up and making sure that things are addressed when they come up. So, are there any questions from the audience? If you have a question, you raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then I'll repeat your question in the mic. You can think about it. So, while the audience is thinking, I want to hear, so we've heard some of the negative stories about being in the tech industry. I'd love to hear a story from some of you or all of you about something positive that you experienced, or a time where you felt included, or where you felt like an organization was doing something really, really well. Nita?
So back in June, I was selected as one of the prospective CEOs of 10-10-10. 10-10-10 is a program where they pick 10 people who have a good shot at creating a startup, present them with 10 problems in the healthcare space, some like really big problems, and then give 10 days where they bring in kind of all these experts in the healthcare field together into this one place for you to dive deep into the problem and kind of go through a sprint process to start coming up with initial business ideas. So ideally, these 10 prospective CEOs become impact entrepreneurs and create businesses to address some of the biggest problems in healthcare. So part of the experience for me was that the woman who recruited the 10 CEOs put a lot of emphasis on diversity, diversity of age, diversity of sexual orientation, diversity of experiences, diversity of gender, and diversity of ethnicity. And so we ended up with a cohort, because if the original requirements that the founder of 10-10-10 had created was that you had to have a $5 million exit at a previous startup. And with that requirement, it pretty much limited the pool of prospective CEOs to white men. And if you're wanting to create impact entrepreneurs, the recruiter of the CEOs convinced the founder of the program to change the criteria from a $5 million exit to, can you fundraise, can you communicate a clear vision, and can you build a team? And those are the three qualities that's how she defined it, and how she got the founder of 10-10-10 to redefine what makes a successful prospective CEO. And because of that definition change, the 10 CEOs, it was half women, half men, 2 millennials, 2 baby boomers, 2 people of color, and everything in between. And that turned out to be an incredibly positive experience, because this was the 3rd year that 10-10-10 had happened, and the previous 2 years they didn't have that kind of diversity. And what happened with our cohort is that we ended up becoming very close and bonded very strongly, to the point where we actually, even though the 10 days are over, the program's over, we still are talking to each other every day and supporting each other and building our businesses, providing each other really sage advice from all the different backgrounds and experiences that we've all had. So I have a much stronger nonprofit background, and a woman that I'm actually going to be getting together for lunch for right after this. She has 20 years building devices for Apple devices. And that's been her only experience, and now she's going to be creating a food delivery service for underserved communities in Denver, and then expanding that to ideally around the country, but she's starting in Denver, but she has no experience doing this, and I've worked with underserved populations, I've started nonprofits, so I've been able to kind of guide her on her journey. She's been able to guide me on the whole, much more of the startup fundraising, building teams, kind of having the resilience that's required to be an entrepreneur, and it's been that way with the rest of my cohort as well. So, I think that's kind of like a positive story that comes when you have a diverse group of people and someone focuses on bringing that diversity to the team. You just end up, in this case, we just ended up really close and thriving.
Yeah, in telling that story, one thing that really struck me was that in order to get that diverse group of people, they had to change the admissions process. They had to really say, what are the qualities that we actually care about these prospective CEOs having, and how can we check for that, as opposed to a more traditional, like you had a $5 million exit. So that really, really resonated with me. Interesting. Other stories of things that have worked.
So I have a small story. I started working as an instructor at Galvanize, and I was the associate instructor and a lead instructor who was a white man. And I felt like coming into the classroom, are these students going to see me the way that some other people outside see me, like non-technical, even though I am? How are they going to perceive me? And so I was working really hard to figure that out for myself, and present myself like, I'm technical, you know, you can trust what I'm saying. And so I did the things I needed to do. But the story is about the lead instructor who brought me to the table, and he would ask me questions. I knew he knew the answers to things, but he would ask me to contribute in front of all the students and give me a position of authority in the classroom to show the students that yes, she knows things, and I trust her knowledge of things, and I want you also to trust her knowledge of things. I thought that was a really great thing for him to do. Whether he was doing it on purpose or not, I don't know, but I think it's something to consider when you're in the working world and you're working with someone who may not have the, who people may not look at and think they know what they're talking about. What can you do to elevate their status as well?
All the stories I can think of right now are just weird, but that's okay. So just again, like this isn't like a huge story here, but on our front-end instructional team, we have a lot of women, and they're all very educated and really just like super smart and really strong, and we call ourselves the bossy ladies, and I just really
They are pretty great. I'll say, like, to talk to the sort of question of like leadership and power. I came from an organization that Teach for America here in Colorado, very mission oriented and vision driven. And when I left the organization, I was looking for new places to go. I will say, like, I did not think I would end up at a tech school. I did not think that I would end up in the tech space at all. Because I too, like, shared that, like, that's not really for me. Like, I don't really know a whole lot. Like, I'm probably not really set up for that. But when I met with Jeff, our executive director, one of the first conversations we had was around, like, I asked him specifically, like, how do you see the mission of Turing playing out on a day-to-day basis? And it's like a pretty simple question, and it's something to think about asking your leadership, or even just thinking about, like, how do you see, like, where we are and, like, how that's playing out. And the story that he told me about, like, how he sees our opportunity to bring in a diverse group of people to potentially change their trajectory and path, from potentially a place where they maybe weren't successful in college, they maybe don't have a job that's consistent, or have been, like, working at a really tedious job that they just, like, haven't been super fulfilled at, and now they're going to come into a place where they're going to be challenged unbelievably and come out of this with not only changing their trajectory but the generations behind them, right? If they choose to have children or whatever that might look like. And the thing that I asked him, right, is, like, what are your core values? Like, what do you value most? And when he talked to me about his values, I knew this was a place that, one, leadership was going to be bought in, but two, that I had some similar values that that he would be open to me saying, like, hey, how about we do some of these, like, different trainings, and what if I, like, change this curriculum and students are going to start talking about microaggressions, and also, like, it's going to be standard and everyone's going to do it. And because of that initial conversation, I think just, like, starting from a point where I wasn't asking him, like, what's your opinion on diversity and inclusion, but really, like, just engaging in the conversation allowed me to see, like, where are my openings, like, where are my doors to be able to actually get some of this work in place, and, like, where do I meet you halfway so that we can, like, go in the same direction. I think that's, like, really important to think about, like, where are there places and opportunities where no one's an expert, like, no one is an expert on diversity and inclusion. In my mind, I don't think anyone's an expert, because we're all still, like, learning and growing. So where are the places where we can maybe, like, learn and grow together? Where are the places where we can take some risks and take some chances together? And I think that's something that really drew me to Turing. I think that's something that keeps me at Turing. And I think that's possible. Like, that's what I hope all of our students take out into the world and, like, take into their organizations, and hopefully then create new ones that are going to be even more aligned with a diverse and inclusive place to be.
I think this is I think Kim gave the prequel to the story I'll tell. So the story about the admissions process for that, the admission process for students in Galvanize was very technical. It was scaring off probably a lot of students in general, but most specifically, I think a higher proportion of women students and potential students, I suppose. And I mean, props to Kim, she spearheaded a lot of this, but we started saying less about what can you do right now, and do we need to sort of evaluate you on your technical abilities before you come into the program, more what kind of qualities of people do we look for. I think we've seen huge increases in, we're still not 50-50, which is of course the goal, but we're getting a lot closer than we were 6 months ago. Super cool, just to see everyone totally on board with that and excited about the idea and the results. I think it's really encouraging.
Great. Looks like we have a question. Zach.
So one of the questions that I have, I know you had mentioned kind of around power and privilege. I'm wondering if you could say more in terms of kind of direct ways to be able to spend that power and privilege, because I know for me, being very aware of my language in terms of being an ally in the groups that I'm not holding dominant stance. And you also mentioned the implicit bias test with Harvard. And one of the thoughts that I had was also the unpacking the invisible knapsack with Peggy McIntosh. So I guess specifically, just wanted to see if you could say more about house spending, some more ways in terms of spending privilege, and thank you for this also.
Zach. So the question is, how do you leverage power and privilege that you have?
Kind of identifying it and kind of speaking to some more ways in terms of how you spend it. And again, for me, kind of thinking about, and one of the ways that I do is really being kind of mindful of kind of languaging. And also, again, when I'm holding a privileged position in one of my dominant categories, depending on when that shifts, like being an ally in that, so being able to speak up or being willing to speak up. So I guess that's one of the, I guess I'm just saying that's one of the ways I do it. So just wanting to hear more in terms of what are some other thoughts around spending power and privilege.
Okay, so I think the question is, how do you identify your power and privilege? Like what lines does that occur on? And then how do you best leverage that to be an ally depending on what situation you're in?
What an awesome question. I wish everyone asked that all the time. Thank you. So I think exactly right. Number one is identifying, and I'm not an expert. I think this is just like the way I think about things. Identifying like what are the places where you do hold power and privilege most often in your sort of day-to-day experience. So there's many ways to do that. You can look at like some identity wheels. You can go through Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I will say like that's mostly along the lines of race and ethnicity, but really thinking about some like major axes, right, are like race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. Thinking about some of those like big lines are a great place to start. Like where do I hold power and privilege? Because each of us holds power and privilege in different scenarios, right? So the thinking about like on my day-to-day, when am I like in the dominant culture for that situation? That means I most likely have more power and privilege than someone who is not in that dominant culture, whatever that culture might be. So I think that's like first and foremost. And then like as you think about those lines and those become more cognizant, you're sort of more aware of them, they're more consistent like as in a part of your day-to-day, it's much easier to think about, okay, so there's